My husband died on a Tuesday. By Friday, another woman was claiming to be Mrs. Warren at his funeral with documents to prove it. I was standing beside David's casket, accepting condolences with numb politeness when she walked in, towel elegant in a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary. At first, I thought she might be a colleague I hadn't met. David's investment firm employed dozens of people I'd never encountered. But then she approached the front, her eyes red-rimmed but her chin high, and handed the funeral director a slip of paper. The director's face went pale. He glanced between us, coughed awkwardly, and whispered something to his assistant. The murmur started immediately. "I'm sorry, but who exactly are you?" I asked. My voice steady despite the surreal nature of the moment. She turned to me, clutching her designer purse with white knuckles. "I am Camila Warren, David's wife." The room went silent. I forced a laugh, though it sounded brittle even to my ears. "Here has been a mistake. I am Emily Warren, David's wife." She opened her purse and removed a folder, handing it to me with trembling hands. I wish that were true. For both our sakes, inside were marriage certificates, dated 3 years before my own. Photos of them together in places I'd never seen: Santorini, Barcelona, a cabin in Aspen, holly cards with both their names, tax documents, and most damning of all, a photo from just 2 months ago, David kissing her beside a swimming pool I didn't recognize. "This is impossible," I whispered, though the evidence was overwhelming. "We've been married for 5 years. He couldn't have 6 years for me," she said quietly. "I am as shocked as you are, my best friend." Jessica appeared at my side, taking the folder and scanning its contents. Her sharp intake of breath told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't some elaborate mistake. "Did you know about me?" I asked, suddenly aware that every mourner in the funeral home was watching our exchange with horrified fascination. Camila shook her head, a single tear tracking down her perfect cheekbone. "Number, did you know about me?" The funeral director intervened, then suggesting we continue this conversation privately. But damage control was impossible. Within minutes, what should have been a dignified farewell to my husband of 5 years had transformed into a spectacle. I watched frozen in place as Camila approached the casket. She placed her hand on the polished wood, whispered something I couldn't hear, and slipped a gold ring inside before turning to leave. Jessica pulled me toward the side room, away from the stairs and whispers, but not before I heard one of David's aunts stage whisper to her neighbor. Owens knew something was off about him. His father was the same way. As the door closed behind us, I sank into a chair, still clutching the folder with evidence of my husband's other life. "And brief," Jessica urged, pushing my head between my knees as spots danced in my vision. "How?" I guessed. "How could he maintain 2 marriages, 2 homes, 2 wives for years?" Jessica had no answer. Neither did I. All I knew was that the man being buried today, the man I'd loved, cooked for, planned a future with, was a stranger. And somewhere across town tonight, another Mrs. Warren was asking herself the same impossible questions. I lifted my head, a cold clarity replacing the initial shock. "I need to know everything," I said. "Every detail, every lie, both of us do." Jessica gave me a worried look. "What are you planning to do?" I stood up, smoothed my black dress, and tucked the folder under my arm. "I am going to follow her. David might be gone, but his lies are very much alive, and I intend to bury them properly." I tore through my house like a hurricane, pulling open drawers, emptying closets, and searching for any evidence of David's deception. How had he maintained 2 separate lives? Where had he hidden the clues? The obvious answer came within hours. In the back of his closet, behind a stack of sweaters he never wore, I found a locked fireproof box. The key wasn't immediately visible, but David had always been methodical. I checked the inside pocket of his rarely used winter coat, and there it was. Inside the box, a second phone, a passport with subtle differences from the one I knew, bank statements from accounts I'd never seen, and a small notebook filled with coded entries. I was married to a man with a secret life, carefully documented and hidden in our own home. The second phone powered on immediately. No password required, a strange oversight for a man so careful. Perhaps he'd been confident I'd never find it. The text messages told a clear story. "Flight delayed, won't be home until tomorrow," sent to Camila on nights he was supposedly with me. "Conference in Chicago running long," sent to me on weekends he was apparently with her. My hands shook as I scrolled through his calendar, seeing our lives laid out in alternating blocks. David had orchestrated a perfectly balanced schedule between 2 wives, 2 homes, 2 existences. The doorbell rang, startling me through the peephole. I saw Meredith, David's best friend from college and a frequent dinner guest at our home. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression somber. "I came as soon as I heard about what happened at the funeral," she said, wrapping me in a hug that I only half returned. "Are you okay?" I stepped back, studying her face. Did you know the flicker in her eyes was enough? My stomach dropped as she followed me into the living room, now strewn with David's belongings. "How long?" I asked, my voice flat. Meredith dropped onto the couch, shoulders slumping. 2 years. I found out by accident, saw them together at a restaurant in Philadelphia. When David told me he was in Denver, she twisted her wedding ring nervously. I confronted him. He swore it was complicated, that he was trying to find a way out that wouldn't destroy everyone involved. "And you believed him?" The ice in my voice was unmistakable. "I wanted to," she admitted. "He kept saying he'd fix it, that he had a plan." Her eyes filled with tears. "I should have told you. I know that now." I turned away, unable to look at her. Another betrayal from someone I trusted. "If you knew for 2 years, who else knew? Was I the only one in the dark, Emily?" "It wasn't like that." David compartmentalized his entire life. He had different friend groups, different colleagues he'd introduced to each of you. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "His business partner Richard knew, I think. They traveled together sometimes." Richard, the man who'd given a heartfelt eulogy just hours ago, talking about David's integrity and loyalty. The irony was almost too much to bear. "I found financial records," I said, gesturing to the papers spread across the coffee table, accounts I never knew about, properties in other states. What else was he hiding? Meredith looked troubled. David's lifestyle, it never quite added up to his income, even with the success of the firm. I froze. "What do you mean?" "Just comments he made sometimes, about investments that seemed too good to be true." Richard would change the subject whenever I asked questions. I thought about our life together, comfortable, but not extravagant. At least I thought so. Now I wondered if the true luxury had been reserved for his other home, his other wife. "I need to understand the full picture," I said, mostly to myself, not just the personal deception, but everything. Meredith nodded slowly. "But here is something else you should know. That woman, Camila, she's not just some random person he met. Her father is Vincent Torres." The name hit like a physical blow. Vincent Torres was a real estate magnate with political connections and rumored ties to less savory enterprises. I'd seen him in the business section of the newspaper and on local news. "Are you saying David married me while being married to the daughter of Vincent Torres?" The implications were staggering. Was this some kind of business arrangement? "I don't know," Meredith said. "But whatever David was involved in, it was bigger than a simple case of 2 timing." As she left, promising to share anything else she remembered, I returned to the box of secrets. Yes, behind a false bottom, I found one more item. A handwritten note with an address in a part of town I rarely visited, and tomorrow's date with a time. 2 p.m. I checked my watch 20 hours until I might get some answers. 20 hours to decide what kind of woman I would be in the aftermath of David Warren's lies. The Clufino was deliberately nondescript, the kind of place where no one would look twice at two women having an intense conversation. I arrived early, choosing a corner table with a view of both the entrance and the emergency exit. Old habits from my former life as a risk analyst. Ironic that I'd failed to analyze the biggest risk in my personal life. I recognized Camila immediately when she walked in, though she'd traded yesterday's designer funeral attire for jeans and an oversized sweater. Without the shock of our first encounter, I could see her more clearly. Early 30s like me, with an air of controlled grace that spoke of expensive education and careful self-monitoring. She spotted me and approached without hesitation, sliding into the seat across from me. Up close, I could see the exhaustion etched around her eyes. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "I wasn't sure you would come. I found this in David's things." I slid the note with today's date across the table. "Must he intended for us to meet anyway?" Her eyebrows rose slightly as she examined the note. "His handwriting," she confirmed. "But why would he? Maybe he knew his house of cards was about to collapse," I suggested, fighting to keep my voice neutral. "Or maybe this is one last manipulation from beyond the grave." Camilla's lips pressed into a thin line. She reached into her bag and produced a manila envelope. "Before we go further, I want you to see these." She spread several documents across the table. Bank statements, property deeds, and what appeared to be investment records. David didn't just lie about our marriages. He lied about everything. I scanned the papers, my analytical mind kicking into gear despite my emotional turmoil. "These accounts. They're in the Caymans, Switzerland, Singapore, and the balance is millions," Camila confirmed, "far more than his legitimate business could generate, and yet somehow they're nearly empty now." I frowned. "What do you mean?" 3 days before the accident, there were massive withdrawals from all these accounts. Pass everything gone. The timing can't be coincidental. The implications hung heavy between us. I took a slow sip of my coffee, buying time to process. "You think his death wasn't an accident?" It wasn't a question, but Camila nodded. "Anyway, a single car accident on a road he'd driven hundreds of times right after liquidating hidden assets. The math doesn't add up. Are you suggesting he faked his death?" The idea seemed absurd, but no more absurd than discovering your husband had another wife. Camila leaned forward, lowering her voice. "The body was identified by Richard, his business partner. The casket was closed at the funeral because of the accident," I countered. The funeral director said what he was told to say." Camila cut in. "I requested to see the body. They refused. I thought about the empty casket at the funeral home, the hasty cremation scheduled for later this week. Had I been too deep in shock to question these arrangements? If David is alive," I said slowly, "then where is he? And whose body was in that car?" Camila shook her head. "But I know someone was stealing from both of us for years. Our separate accounts were being systematically drained in small amounts, not enough to notice immediately, but substantial over time. I thought about the credit card bills that had seemed slightly higher than expected, the investment returns that never quite matched the market performance David reported." "You think David was stealing from us?" I asked, though the evidence was mounting. "Or someone was stealing from all of us," I cried. David. Camila pulled out one more document, a life insurance policy naming both of us as beneficiaries dated just 3 months ago. Why would he do this if he planned to disappear with the money? And look at the beneficiary clause. I read it carefully, my legal training from a former career catching the unusual language. The policy would pay out only if both named beneficiaries agreed to the distribution of funds. He was forcing us to work together, I realized aloud, even after death. Camila nodded grimly, which brings me to why I really wanted to meet. "I need your help, Emily, and I think you need mine. Whatever David was involved in, it's bigger than his deception to us. And potentially dangerous. What exactly are you suggesting?" "A truce," she said simply. "We pool our information, trace the money, and find out what really happened to our husband. Then we decide what to do with whatever we discover." I studied her face, looking for signs of deception, but all I saw was the same determination I felt, to uncover the truth, no matter how ugly. "One condition," I said finally, "for honesty between us, no more secrets." Camila extended her hand across the table. Deal. As we shook on our unusual alliance, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop asking questions if you want to stay safe." I showed it to Camila, whose face paled slightly. Without a word, she turned her own phone screen toward me, displaying an identical message received just minutes before someone was watching us, and they didn't like our newfound partnership. I'd always considered myself reasonably intelligent. I graduated near the top of my class, built a respectable career before scaling back to support David's, and generally prided myself on not being easily fooled. Yet here I was, sitting in a rented office space with my husband's other wife, unraveling what appeared to be an elaborate financial conspiracy that had operated right under my nose for years. We'd set up our makeshift investigation headquarters in a WeWork office, paid for in cash, using fake names. Camilla's paranoia had seemed excessive at first, until a second warning text arrived while we were setting up. Pounced a warning "walk away now" on the whiteboard before us. We'd mapped out everything we knew David's legitimate business. Warren Capital Partners occupied the center with a web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and suspicious transactions radiating outward. The amounts were staggering. "This is money laundering," I said, stepping back to survey our work. "Guinea sophisticated money laundering?" Camila nodded, tapping a marker against her palm. "The question is, whose money was being laundered, and was David a willing participant or a fall guy?" The most troubling pattern we'd uncovered was a series of transfers between Warren Capital and Allied Investment Group, Richard's separate business entity that operated under the same roof. Money would move from Allied to Warren, then fragment into dozens of smaller transactions before reconsolidating in offshore accounts. "We need to talk to Richard," I said, circling his name for the third time. "He's the common denominator in almost everything." Camila looked skeptical. "He won't talk to us voluntarily, and if he's involved, approaching him directly could be dangerous." "Then we don't approach directly." I pulled up a calendar on my laptop. "The firm is hosting a client appreciation event tomorrow night at the Grayson. As David's widow, I'd be expected to make an appearance." "Widows," Camila corrected with a grim smile. "And I've attended these events before when David couldn't make it. My presence wouldn't raise eyebrows. We go together, then divide and conquer. I'll approach Richard. You work the room for information from the other partners." She nodded slowly, then froze, pointing to a transaction record we'd overlooked. "Look at this. Deposit $2 million from Torres Development to Alid, then immediately dispersed through Warren Capital. Torres, her father's company." Camila's face had gone pale. "He didn't know?" I asked carefully. She shook her head. "My father and I, we aren't close. But if he's connected to this," she didn't finish the thought. The pieces were aligning into an unsettling picture. sure. David's marriage to Camila had likely been strategic, connecting him to Torres and his resources. But where did I fit into this scheme? Was I simply cover a respectable facade for a man laundering money for possibly criminal enterprises? My phone rang, interrupting our speculation. Meredith's name flashed on the screen. Thank God, you answered. Her voice was tight with anxiety. Richard came by my house asking questions about you. Wanted to know if you'd mentioned anything strange about David's business, if you'd been in contact with unusual people. When I asked why, he said he was concerned about your mental state after the funeral incident. What did you tell him? Nothing useful, sure. But Emily, he seemed off, not grief-stricken, more like calculating, and he had someone waiting in the car. I couldn't see who. After hanging up, I relayed the conversation to Camila, who immediately began packing up our materials. We've been compromised, she said tersely. If Richard is actively looking for you, this location isn't safe. We relocated to a hotel room, paying cash again and checking in under false names. The anonymity of the bland corporate trainer provided cold comfort as we continued piecing together the financial puzzle. Around midnight, my laptop pinged with an alert. I'd set up monitoring on our joint accounts with David, and a new transaction had just been processed. A wire transfer for $50,000 to an entity called Monarch Calvin. That's impossible, I whispered. These accounts should be frozen. Camila leaned over my shoulder, her perfume momentarily distracting me. Shevin has access, or David isn't dead, I said, voicing the thought we'd both been circling. To hear is one way to find out. Camila pulled out her phone. My father's head of security owes me a favor. He can access death certificates and coroner's reports without raising flags. As she stepped into the bathroom to make the call, I stared at the transaction details. Monarch Beijing was unfamiliar, but the authorization code contained David's standard pattern, a specific sequence of numbers he used as a personal barrier in business dealings. Either someone had perfectly mimicked David's financial fingerprint, or my dead husband was very much alive and moving money around. Camila returned, her expression unreadable. The coroner's preliminary report shows dental records matching David's. The body was real. Then who's accessing these accounts? She sat heavily on the edge of the bed. The toxicology report showed unusual substances in the bloodstream, compounds that would cause unconsciousness before the crash. The implications were clear. If David had been drugged before the accident, his death was no accident at all. We're not just following money anymore, I said quietly. We're investigating a murder. Camila nodded grimly. And if Richard is involved, we're walking into his territory tomorrow night. We fell silent, the gravity of our situation settling over us. I found myself studying Camila, this woman who should have been my enemy but was rapidly becoming my only ally. In another life, we might have been friends. Now we were reluctant partners in unraveling the dark legacy of the man we'd both called husband. We need better protection than just burner phones and fake names, I said finally. If Richard killed David, we're next on his list. Camila reached into her bag and removed a small handgun, placing it on the table between us. I am one step ahead of you. I stared at the weapon, then back at her. You know how to use that? A humorless smile crossed her face. Cunkering up as Vincent Torres's daughter came with certain practical lessons. And yes, I have a permit. As we finalized our plan for the next evening, I wondered which of us David had truly known better, and which of us he had underestimated more severely. The Grayson Hotel's grand ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and the subtle displays of wealth that characterized David's professional circle. Camila and I arrived separately but kept visual contact across the room. I'd opted for understated elegance, a black sheath dress that communicated the appropriate mourning while still being business appropriate. Camila, by contrast, wore a striking burgundy gown that drew every eye in the room, perfect distraction tactics. Richard spotted me by the bar and approached with practiced sympathy etched on his features. Emily, I am touched you came. This must be difficult. I am trying to maintain connections to David's world, I replied, watching his expression carefully. He would have wanted the business to continue smoothly. Something flickered behind Richard's eyes, calculation, perhaps, or relief at my apparent naivety. That's admirable. David always said you were remarkably understanding about his dedication to the firm. He signaled the bartender. Can I get you a drink? Just sparkling water? Thanks. I am still on medication from the shock. This fabrication accomplished two things. It explained any unusual behavior on my part and ensured I kept a clear head. Across the room, Camila was engaged in animated conversation with one of the junior partners. Our plan was in motion. While I kept Richard occupied, she would extract information from the other employees who might have insights into the firm's shadier dealings. Richard, I said, lowering my voice, here is something I wanted to ask you privately after the funeral. That woman, was she really a disturbed individual? Richard interrupted smoothly. We've had her investigated. She has a history of fixating on successful men, creating elaborate fantasies. David dealt with her previously. We think that's how she obtained those forged documents. The lie was delivered with such conviction that, had I not seen the evidence myself, I might have been persuaded. That's a relief, I said, feigning gratitude. I've been torturing myself with doubts, completely unnecessary. David was devoted to you. Richard placed a comforting hand on my arm. In fact, he left some personal items at the office I've been meaning to return. Would you mind stepping upstairs briefly? I'd rather not bring them down to the party. Warning bells clanged in my mind, but this was exactly the opportunity we'd hoped for, access to the firm's offices after hours. Of course, I agreed, catching Camila's eye briefly as Richard guided me toward the elevators. The office floor was dimly lit with only security lights illuminating the sleek corridor. Richard used his key card to access the executive suite, ushering me into David's office, a space I'd visited only a handful of times during our marriage. Should be right here, Richard murmured, opening a cabinet behind the desk. David mentioned wanting you to have these if anything ever happened to him, as he rummaged through the drawer. I quickly scanned the desktop, noting a folder labeled Monarch, Beijing harshly visible beneath other papers. Here we are, Richard turned, holding a small box. Family jewelry, I believe? I accepted the box, opening it to find several pieces I recognized from photos of David's mother. Thank you, this means a lot. David valued family legacy, Richard said, watching me intently. Pike of which I've been meaning to discuss the firm's succession plans with you. As David's widow, you inherit his stake in the company. I assumed that would be the case, I replied carefully. There are some complications, however. Forced-in investments, structural changes. He moved toward the door, subtly blocking my exit. We should schedule a proper meeting to review everything. Some decisions need to be made quickly. I nodded, trying to appear appropriately interested while looking for a way to access the Monarch file without his knowledge. My phone buzzed, a text from Camila. Didet Noel umta estropi m. Meredith. Before I could process this, Richard's phone rang. His expression darkened as he checked the screen. Excuse me, I need to take this. He stepped just outside the office door, keeping me in his line of sight as he spoke in hushed tones. I had seconds, not minutes. I quickly slid the Monarch folder into my clutch, replacing it with similar-looking documents from another stack. As Richard concluded his call, I moved toward the door, smiling apologetically. I should get back to the party. me. I promised David's cousin a dance. Richard smiled and reached his eyes. I'll walk you down. The elevator ride was tense, Richard standing closer than necessary. When we reached the ballroom, I scanned for Camila but couldn't locate her. Meredith, however, was by the bar looking agitated. As I approached, Richard was called away by another partner. Where have you been? Meredith hissed. I've been trying to warn you. What's happening? I asked, maintaining a pleasant expression for onlookers. I overheard Richard on the phone earlier. He knows you've been asking questions. And that woman Camila, she just left with someone. It looked tense. My blood ran cold. Who was she? With a man I didn't recognize. Older, expensively dressed. She didn't look happy, but she went willingly. Vincent Torres had her father intervened. Meredith, I need to tell you something and you won't believe it. I lowered my voice. David and Richard were involved in money laundering, possibly worse. The accident wasn't an accident, she finished, her eyes filling with tears. I know. I stared at her, you know. She glanced around nervously, then pulled me into a quiet alcove. David called me the night before he died. He was scared, Emily. Said he'd gotten in over his head, that Richard had connected him with dangerous people. He wanted out, but knew too much. Why didn't you tell me this before? Her face crumpled because I was the reason he got involved in the first place. Her voice dropped to a whisper. David and I were having an affair, had been for years. Richard found out, used it as leverage to pull David into whatever scheme they were running. Said he'd tell you everything if David didn't cooperate. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Not just the lie of our marriage, but the betrayal from a woman I'd considered a friend, and Camila. I managed to ask a business arrangement. Initially, David told me her father needed certain financial services. The marriage was part of cementing the relationship, but I think he genuinely cared for her in his way, just not enough to be faithful to either of us. Where would Richard take her? If he arranged for Torres to remove her from the equation? Meredith shook her head. That's what I've been trying to tell you. I don't think it was Torres who took her. The man she left with, one of the security guys, called him agent. The BI sexy, the implications spun through my mind. If federal authorities were involved, my clutch felt suddenly heavy with the stolen folder. I needed to review those documents immediately, but not here, not with Richard potentially watching. I have to go, I said, already moving toward the exit. Emily, wait. Meredith caught my arm. To hear is something else. That life insurance policy for you and Camila? Richard made David take it out. Said it was protection for everyone involved. Protection for whom I don't know. But be careful, Richard isn't just David's partner. He's the architect of whatever they're involved in, and he's smart enough to have contingency plans for everything. As I stepped into the cool night air, my phone buzzed again, a text from Camila's number, but the style was all wrong. Meeting at the hotel. Bringing what you found, come alone. Whoever had Camila's phone was trying to lure me in, which meant Camila herself was in danger, or working against me. Either way, I couldn't trust anyone now, not even my husband's other wife. I didn't go to the hotel. Instead, I drove to a 24-hour diner across town, one David and I had frequented during the early days of our relationship. The nostalgic choice was deliberate. It was the last place anyone would look for me while I sorted through my options. In a back booth, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold, I carefully examined the Monarch meeting file. The documents confirmed our worst suspicions. Monarch was a shell company jointly controlled by Richard and Vincent Torres, with David serving as the operational manager. They'd been moving money through a complex network of seemingly legitimate investments, obscuring the original source, which appeared to be Torres's less reputable business ventures. But there was something else, notations in David's handwriting suggesting he'd been documenting discrepancies. Small amounts diverted from the already illegal operation skimmed by someone with inside access. David had been investigating internal theft within their money laundering operation. My phone buzzed again. My morning, return the files or she dies. Attached was a photo of Camila seemingly unconscious in what looked like a warehouse office. Richard wasn't just making threats. He was actively dangerous. I needed leverage and allies. After a moment's consideration, I called the number that had texted from Camila's phone. Richard answered immediately. Where are my files, Emily? Safe, I replied, keeping my voice steady. Along with copies of everything Camila and I discovered about Warren Capital's activities. I apply her and you get the originals, hurt her, and everything goes to the FBI. Richard's laugh was chilling. You are bluffing. You haven't contacted the authorities. You can't. You are implicated too as David's wife. The money that paid for your comfortable life? All dirty, try me, I countered. I'd rather face consequences than let you hurt anyone else. You killed David, didn't you? A pause. David made choices, poor ones. He became a liability and now you think we're liabilities too. You could be assets instead, Richard suggested, his tone shifting to something almost reasonable. The income flows. You and Camila receive your shares as David's widows. Sepsinan wins, except David. He was weak, Semble having moral qualms, keeping records, threatening to expose everything. We couldn't allow that. We, not just Richard. Then I want proof Camila is alive, I insisted. Then we can discuss terms. There was muffled conversation on Richard's end. Then Camila's voice came through strained but clear. Emily, don't. The line returned to Richard, satisfied. Now, the files. The warehouse at 1400 River Street, 1 hour. Come alone. After he hung up, I sat motionless, thinking through scenarios. Walking into an obvious trap was suicide, but I couldn't abandon Camila. She'd been drawn into this mess the same way I had through David's deception. I pulled out my second phone, a burner Camila had insisted we each carry, and dialed the only number programmed into it. A man answered on the first ring. Status? His voice was curt. Professional? Compromised, I replied, using the code word Camila had taught me. Richard has her at 1400 River Street, 1 hour deadline, understood, maintain distance. Will extract. The line went dead, leaving me with more questions than answers. Who had Camila connected us with private security? Law enforcement? I hadn't asked enough questions when she'd set up our emergency protocol, too late for regrets now. I had to trust that whoever was on the other end of that call was equipped to help Camila. Meanwhile, I needed to secure the evidence. I drove to the public library, used their scanner to create digital copies of everything, and emailed the files to multiple secure accounts. Then I prepared to meet Richard, but not as the grieving, naive widow he expected. The warehouse district was deserted at this hour.